Welcome back to part 2 of lecture 13. We ended the last video by talking about some of the factors that led to the stock market crash. And now I want to talk about a few of the issues that led to this being a sustained problem. The market could have just gone down temporarily and then bounced right back up. Now, there's been books written on this topic, so I am dramatically oversimplifying things, just understand that. But some of the main points that I want you to understand is that we're going to start to see bank failures throughout the country. During normal times, people store their money for safekeeping in banks. Well, as many Americans were losing money in the market and increasingly starting to lose their job as corporations start to lay off employees in a bid to save money, we're going to start to see so-called bank runs. People coming into their local bank and withdrawing every cent of money from their savings and taking it home. This is catastrophic for the banking industry. Banks need more people depositing money into the bank than they need people withdrawing money from the bank. Remember, too, that some of these banks had given out loans to private investors, to corporate investors in the run-up to Black Tuesday, and now these banks are also losing money. Not only are the loan amounts not being repaid, but they're not getting interest from them either. This makes for many banks getting into a financial situation in which they are literally forced to shutter their doors. And during this period, there are no safeguards for people to be able to recoup or get back their savings accounts. If a bank closes during this period, your money is just gone. There's no one to appeal to for help or restitution of funds. Therefore, as word got out that banks are starting to close, this exacerbated these bank runs. Now people are saying, oh my gosh, I've got to get to the First Bank of Omaha, or I've got to get there and get my money, and this only speeds up the collapse of many banks throughout the country. Without banks, future businessmen cannot go and apply for business loans to open up new businesses. Future homeowners have nowhere to go to apply for mortgages. So the fact that we have a massive banking collapse in the country, it really just stymies new innovation, new businesses. It prevents people from getting loans for homes. It has a far-reaching effect for years. Another issue that deepens this crisis over time rather than alleviating it was the fact that even before Black Tuesday, we have what's known as an existing maldistribution of wealth in the United States. If you've heard of the phrase, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, that was what was taking place during the 1920s. Not everyone was sharing equally in the stock market buildup. For instance, during this period, the top 5% wealthiest in the United States owned 30% of the nation's aggregate income. This was aided by the Coolidge administration's tax cut for the wealthy, which only increased the proportion of the national wealth concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer. Therefore, when the Great Depression finally arrived after Black Tuesday, the spending power of the average American was much less. They could now not afford items such as cars or household appliances, consumer goods that before had really powered the bulk of the U.S.'s manufacturing before this period. There's no one to buy these items now. As this economic crisis began to drag on for weeks and then months and gradually into years, we start to see American employers laying off workers by the tens of thousands and then by the millions. The unemployment rate began to spike precipitously, despite the fact that President Hoover tried to coax these business leaders into not doing that. He said, let's just stay the course. The market will correct itself sooner rather than later. Don't do anything rash like, laying off a lot of employees. But business leaders were unconvinced. And here's where we really see the ripple effect of what started on Wall Street now affecting your average American. Now, individuals who didn't even know what the stock market was, had never gambled with their money in that fashion, are finding that they no longer have a job at RCA or Ford or Westinghouse. And so while they were not directly tied to the stock market crash, they are very much feeling the effects of this economic collapse. So by the time we get to 1932, we have another presidential election rolling around. Hoover will be seeking a second term in the White House, but he's losing popularity rapidly. Hoover remained very reluctant to use the power of the federal government to directly intervene in the economy, the sort of laissez-faire view that we've already talked about. Instead, Hoover emphasized that Americans should rely upon private charitable organizations to turn to for help in case they needed housing or clothing or food, and that American businesses should stay the course. In other words, that they should not lay off any more people. They should just kind of continue on ahead, and that the country will soon pull out of this. That was what Hoover maintained when he was on the campaign trail in 1932. However, public sentiment continued to turn against him. He was booed and jeered at campaign stops. He had rotten vegetables thrown at him. The American people were now unconvinced that there was going to be any quick solution to this problem, and they also believed that the president was increasingly tone deaf, that he just didn't seem to care about the plight of people starving to death on street corners. His campaign slogans, such as "the worst is past" or "prosperity is just around the corner," rang hollow for most Americans. Worse, from the standpoint of Hoover's re-election campaign, we'll see a public relations nightmare unfold during the summer of 1932. We have thousands of veterans who had served their country bravely in the Great War, who are out of work, down on their luck, homeless in some cases, and they are owed a pension check from the U.S. government for their service on behalf of their country. The big problem from their standpoint is that their military pension checks, or bonus checks, were not due to be paid to them until 1945, more than a decade in the future. For many of these veterans, they said, I may not be alive a decade from now. My family is homeless and starving today. We can't wait. So during the summer of 1932, you're going to see what becomes known as the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the Bonus Army, converging on our nation's capital. That year, thousands of veterans from across the country began descending upon the Capitol and setting up camp like an informal shantytown on the steps of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. They wanted to be a very visible reminder to their legislators, their senators, their congressmen, that we're not going anywhere until you approve early payment of our military pension. For President Hoover, who again is seeking re-election, this does not look good. You can imagine there were droves of reporters talking to these men, getting their hard luck stories and reprinting them in newspapers across the country. So for Hoover, he will make an unfortunate decision. He's going to call out the U.S. Army to disperse the veterans on the steps of Capitol Hill. The U.S. Army will not treat its veterans very nicely in this case. The veterans are not willing to move, so the Army will deploy tear gas to try and force them out. They'll manhandle some of these veterans. They'll ultimately set this shantytown on fire. I don't know how well you can make out in the picture on the slide, but this was a famous photograph of the fires raging on the steps of Capitol Hill. If you look in the background through the mists of smoke, you can just make out the Capitol Rotunda here in the background. So a public that already believed that their president was being callous and not providing federal aid to people who needed it, this treatment of veterans was, the icing on the cake for them. They do not want Hoover as their president any longer.